I found a birthday invite from my best friend at my parents' house. She's been missing for 3 years. I should have known something was wrong when my parents called me begging to house sit. 3 years after I left home, they never once called me. Not even on my birthday or for Christmas. When I arrived, everything was pretty much exactly how I remembered it. So when I saw a creepy piece of paper hanging out in front of the basement door that my parents told me never to open, well, it stood out. Every horror movie instinct of mine told me to ignore it, to listen to my parents, pretend it's not there. But it bugged me, like an itch I couldn't reach. I went downstairs and picked it up. It was a dirty invitation written on scrap paper that read, "You're invited to Sherry's birthday party. Today, downstairs." The ink was still fresh. My hands started shaking. Sherry was a close friend who had gone missing right after I left for college. The whole town searched for her. Even my parents went out helping put up missing posters in the neighborhood. This was next level messed up. I called my friend Roger, who lived a few houses down, to see this because honestly, I was half convinced I was losing my mind. Roger looked at the invitation and then at me, whistling. "Wow, this is seriously effed up. Where did you find it?" he asked. I led him down to the basement and he knocked on the door. "Hello? We're here for the party," he joked. I held my breath, hoping there wouldn't even be a response. There wasn't. "Okay, that's enough of that," I started to say, but Roger stopped me. He pulled out a little pocket tool and started picking at the lock. "Roger! What are you doing?" I hissed. "My parents said the basement's full of asbestos. Are you trying to get us killed?" But he continued working with the lock, completely focused until it clicked open and dropped to the floor beside out with a loud clang. The basement looked pretty normal. No asbestos, just a washer, dryer, Christmas decorations in a plastic bin. But the back wall looked wrong. The paneling didn't match the walls at all. Roger pushed on it and suddenly the entire section swung inward. Behind it was another door with a more complicated padlock on the outside. "I don't suppose you can pick this lock too?" I asked. We ended up breaking the padlock with a hammer from my dad's toolbox. We pushed the door open and found a room surrounded by thick, soundproof padding. And in the middle of it all was Sherry, my best friend who had mysteriously disappeared. She was pale, had hair so long it nearly reached the ground. Her ankle was raw and bleeding where a chain had been. She held a metal pipe above her head, her eyes wide as she screamed, "Stay back! I'm warning you!" "Sherry?" Roger called out in disbelief. Recognition flooded her face instantly. "Wait, you're not them." That's when she dropped the pipe and started sobbing. "Please help me." We helped her up to my bedroom and started cleaning up her wounds when she opened up. "How long have I been missing for?" she asked us with a blank expression. 3 years, I told her quietly. She nodded. "Sherry, what happened to you? What's with the birthday invitation?" Roger asked when I couldn't. Somehow I knew the answer. She looked at me with a bitter expression. "Your parents called me over, saying you'd sent a gift from college and wanted me to have it. They made me tea and cookies, and I remember feeling sleepy. Then I woke up here, chained up, tortured every night. I tried yelling for help, but help never came." She told us the horrible things my parents did to her, taunting her whenever a new missing person flyer came up, telling her the things they would do to her parents if they're ever caught. She explained how she pried a piece of metal from a pipe in the bathroom and had been slowly filing away at the chain. She'd finally broken free the morning I showed up. The invitation was supposed to be for them, to lure them in. "I need to stop them before they hurt my parents or anyone else," she said in a cold voice. "This is insane," Roger told her. "Let's just go to the police and—" "No. This ends now. Are you going to help me or not?" I stared at her, unable to process it. I mean, these people were my parents. She grabbed a few things from my room to use as a weapon and held one out to me, waiting. That's when we heard the front door slam. "Honey, we're home early," Mom called out from downstairs. "The conference got canceled. You can go home now," Dad added. I heard their footsteps grow louder, the stairs creaking each time they got closer. Sherry grabbed my arm and stared at my face, whispering, "I'm sorry, but I'm ending this." She hid behind my door just as my parents opened it. They stared at me with a surprised look. Sherry held up scissors and— Mom screamed and Dad lunged forward trying to grab the scissors, but Sherry slashed them toward his reaching hand and caught his palm with a shallow cut that immediately started bleeding. I stood frozen in the doorway watching blood drip onto my childhood bedroom carpet, and everything felt surreal and wrong, like I was watching a movie instead of my actual life. Roger shouted that he was calling 911 right now and pulled out his phone while Mom started talking really fast, saying Sherry was mentally unstable and broke into our house and we needed to help them restrain her. Dad clutched his bleeding hand and backed toward the hallway, and his eyes kept darting between all of us like he was doing math in his head, figuring out his next move. Sherry kept the scissors raised and positioned herself between my parents and the door, and her whole body was shaking. But her voice came out steady when she told Roger to stay on the line with the operator. I finally moved and stepped beside Sherry even though my legs barely held me up, and I told my parents not to come any closer. Mom switched tactics completely and started crying and begging me to understand they were just trying to protect Sherry from herself because she was suicidal when she came to them 3 years ago. The lies sounded almost believable in Mom's trembling voice, and and for one horrible second I wanted to believe her. But then I remembered the chain marks on Sherry's ankle and the soundproof room in the basement. Dad tried to edge toward the stairs, saying he needed medical attention for his hand, but Roger blocked the top of the staircase and told him the police were 2 minutes away. The house felt smaller and hotter as we all stood there in this awful standoff, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears and smell the metallic scent of Dad's blood. Sirens wailed in the distance, getting louder, and Mom made one last desperate attempt, grabbing my arm and whispering that I was their daughter, and I needed to back them up, or they would go to prison. I pulled away from her touch, and the look on her face shifted from pleading to something cold and hard that I had never seen before, like a mask falling off. 4 police officers rushed through the front door that Roger had left unlocked, and the scene exploded into this controlled chaos as they separated everyone into different rooms, asking what was going on. 2 paramedics arrived right behind the officers and immediately started examining Sherry's injuries, while she gave them a quick rundown of being held captive in the basement for 3 years. A female officer with short brown hair took me to the living room and asked me to explain what happened. So I told her everything from finding the invitation to breaking open the basement room to my parents coming home early. My voice sounded strange and disconnected as I described my own parents as kidnappers, and the officer's expression stayed carefully blank while she took notes on a small pad. Mom kept performing for the officers in the kitchen, and her voice carried through the house as she insisted this was all a terrible misunderstanding, and Sherry was confused and needed psychiatric help. Dad sat silently in the dining room getting his hand bandaged by a paramedic, and I could see him through the doorway just watching everything with those calculating eyes like he was still looking for an angle. The paramedics wanted to take Sherry to the hospital for a full examination and treatment of her injuries, but she refused to go until she knew my parents would not be released tonight. The lead officer made a call and told someone on the phone that this was way beyond a simple domestic disturbance, and they needed a detective and crime scene unit to come process the house. Detective Heather Hansen showed up about 20 minutes later in an unmarked sedan. She looked to be in her 40s with short brown hair and these tired eyes that made it clear she'd seen plenty of awful things in her career. She went straight to the ambulance where the paramedics were still checking Sherry over and started talking to her in a low voice I couldn't hear from where the officer had me sitting on the front porch. I watched through the ambulance window as Sherry talked and talked, her hands moving as she explained everything, and Detective Hansen just nodded and took notes without interrupting. The whole conversation probably lasted 15 minutes, but it felt longer as I sat there wondering what Sherry was telling her and whether the detective would believe any of it. A van pulled up and 4 people in jackets with crime scene unit printed on the back climbed out with cameras and equipment cases. They started setting up lights in the driveway, and 2 of them headed straight for the basement entrance. I heard one of them say something about getting photos before anything got disturbed further, and the other one responded that they needed to document the chain setup and soundproofing materials. The female officer who'd interviewed me earlier came back and told me Detective Hansen would want to speak with me next, but I needed to wait until she finished with Sherry. I just nodded because what else could I do? Roger was sitting on his parents' porch across the street and I could see him on his phone, probably texting someone about this insane situation. More neighbors had come out now and were standing in clusters on their lawns, staring at all the police vehicles and whispering to each other. I recognized Mrs. Chen from 3 houses down, and the Robertsons who lived next door, and they all kept glancing at me with these shocked expressions. One of the crime scene techs came up from the basement and I heard him tell his partner that the setup looked professional, like someone had really planned it out with proper soundproofing and reinforced mounting points for the restraints. His partner said something about how this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment thing, and the first tech agreed, saying the materials alone would have cost serious money. My stomach twisted hearing them talk about it so casually, like they were discussing a construction project instead of the room where my parents tortured my best friend. Detective Hansen finished with Sherry and walked over to where I was sitting. She introduced herself properly and asked if I was ready to give a statement. I said yes, even though I wasn't sure I was ready for anything. She led me back into the house, into the living room where we sat on the couch that suddenly felt foreign and wrong. She pulled out a small recorder and asked if it was okay to record our conversation. I nodded and she pressed the button. Then she asked me to start from the beginning, from when my parents called asking me to the house sit. I walked her through everything, from the weird phone call after 3 years of silence, to finding the invitation to breaking into the basement to discovering Sherry. My voice sounded flat and distant as I described it all, like I was reading from a script instead of talking about my actual life. Detective Hansen asked specific questions about my relationship with my parents, whether I'd ever suspected anything, if there were any signs I might have missed. Each question felt like an accusation, even though her tone stayed neutral and professional. I told her about the basement being off-limits my whole childhood, about how my parents always ran fans or music in the house, about how they discouraged me from having friends over. She wrote everything down and asked follow-up questions about dates and times and specific conversations I could remember. The shame of missing all those signs sat heavy in my chest and made it hard to breathe properly. When she asked if my parents had ever acted strangely around my friends, especially around the time Sherry disappeared, I had to think hard. I remembered them being really helpful with the missing person search, really concerned and supportive of Sherry's family. That memory made me feel sick now, knowing they were pretending to care while they had her locked in our basement. Detective Hansen thanked me for being thorough and said she knew this was incredibly difficult. Then she went to interview Roger. I watched through the window as she talked to him on his parents' porch, and he gestured a lot as he explained everything. The interview lasted maybe 20 minutes, and when it was done, I saw her shake his hand and say something that made him nod seriously. Later, Roger told me she'd thanked him for calling 911 so fast and said his quick thinking probably stopped my parents from destroying evidence or running away. The crime scene techs were still working in the basement, and I could see camera flashes lighting up the stairwell. More officers arrived and started searching the rest of the house, opening closets and drawers, looking through everything. One of them came out of my parents' bedroom carrying a laptop in an evidence bag. Another one had a box of papers and files. It was surreal watching strangers pick through my childhood home like it was a crime scene, which I guess it was now. Around midnight, Detective Hansen came back and told my parents they were being detained for questioning. She explained that the house was now an official crime scene and would be sealed for investigation. Mom started crying again, these big dramatic sobs, and kept asking for a lawyer. Dad just sat there in the dining room where they'd kept him separated from Mom, and he stared straight at me with this look I couldn't figure out. Was it disappointment that I'd let them down? Anger that I'd helped Sherry? Or maybe just cold calculation as he tried to figure out how badly their plan had failed and whether there was any way to fix it. 2 officers led them out in handcuffs, and Mom was still crying and calling my name, begging me to help them, to tell everyone this was all a misunderstanding. I looked away and didn't say anything. The ambulance was still parked in the driveway, and Detective Hansen went back to talk to Sherry again. This time when she came back, she told me Sherry had agreed to go to the hospital for a full exam and treatment. I asked if I could ride with her, and the detective said that would be fine. Roger said he'd follow in his car. Sherry was on the stretcher, and when I climbed into the ambulance, she reached out and grabbed my hand. She held on tight the whole drive to the hospital, her fingers digging into my palm. She kept saying she was sorry, that she never meant to bring this horror into my life. I told her she had nothing to apologize for, that none of this was her fault, but I don't think she believed me. At the hospital, the staff treated Sherry with this careful kindness that made it clear they knew what kind of case this was. Nurses moved around her gently, asking permission before touching her, explaining everything they were doing. They took her back to an exam room, and a nurse practitioner came out to explain to me that they were doing a full forensic exam. She said this was standard procedure for suspected kidnapping and assault cases, that they'd be documenting every injury and collecting evidence. I sat down in the waiting room with Roger, and we barely talked. What was there to say? My parents were monsters who'd tortured my best friend for 3 years, and I'd lived my whole life completely clueless. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out to see a text from Mom's number. It said, "Please come home so we can explain everything properly." I showed it to a uniformed officer who was stationed near the waiting room entrance, and he immediately asked for my phone. He bagged it as evidence and gave me a receipt. 3 hours passed while they examined Sherry. Roger got us coffee from a vending machine, but it tasted like cardboard and I couldn't finish it. Around 3 a.m., a man in business casual clothes walked into the waiting room and introduced himself as Troy Hansen, a victim advocate from the county. He explained that his job was to help victims navigate the criminal justice system and connect them with resources. He said Detective Hansen had already assigned him to Sherry's case. He talked to me and Roger together first, explaining what would happen next with the investigation and potential court proceedings. Then he asked to speak with me privately, and we moved to a quieter corner of the waiting room. He told me gently that I was also considered a victim in this situation because my parents had used me to maintain their cover and violated my trust in a fundamental way. He recommended I not return to the house and asked if I had somewhere safe to stay. I hadn't even thought about that until he asked. Where was I supposed to go? My parents' house was a crime scene and also the last place I wanted to be. Roger had offered to let me stay with his parents, but Troy said it might be better if I stayed somewhere my parents didn't know about, just in case they made bail. He had information about a crisis shelter with space available, and even though it felt weird needing a shelter, I agreed it was probably the safest option. Troy came back about 20 minutes later and told me a doctor had examined Sherry and wanted to admit her for at least 2 days. She was severely malnourished and dehydrated, plus the wounds on her ankle from the chain were infected and needed treatment. They were setting up a private room with security stationed outside because this was an active criminal case. I asked if I could see her before I left, and Troy said he'd check. He disappeared down a hallway and returned with a nurse who led me through a maze of corridors to a room at the end of a quiet wing. Sherry was sitting up in the hospital bed wearing a clean gown, her impossibly long hair spread across the pillow. An IV drip fed into her arm, and monitors beeped softly beside her. We looked at each other for what felt like forever without saying anything. Her eyes were different now, older somehow, like she'd lived multiple lifetimes in that basement. She finally spoke and told me she didn't blame me for what my parents did, but I could see everything else in her face that she didn't say out loud. Relief that she was finally free, anger at what was stolen from her, grief for the 3 years she'd never get back, and something that looked like pity when she looked at me, which somehow hurt worse than if she'd just been angry. I wanted to apologize or explain or promise things would be okay, but none of those words felt right. Instead, I just squeezed her hand once and told her I'd check on her tomorrow. She nodded and closed her eyes, and I left before I started crying in front of her. Troy drove me across town as the sky started turning gray with early morning light. The crisis shelter was in an older building downtown with bars on the windows and a security buzzer at the door. An intake coordinator met us in the lobby and walked me through paperwork while Troy waited nearby. She gave me a small private room on the second floor with a twin bed, a dresser, and a bathroom down the hall. Clean towels and basic toiletries were stacked on the dresser, along with sweatpants and a t-shirt that weren't mine but were clean. Troy gave me his direct number and told me to call anytime, day or night, if I needed anything or felt unsafe. After he left, I sat on the narrow bed and stared at the wall. Dawn light filtered through the thin curtain over the single window. My parents were monsters who'd tortured my best friend for 3 years in a soundproof room under the house where I grew up. That sentence kept running through my head, but it didn't feel real. Nothing felt real. I lay down on top of the blanket, fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling, trying to process that my entire childhood was built on lies. I finally fell asleep around 7 in the morning and woke up 3 hours later to my phone buzzing nonstop on the dresser. 6 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I picked it up and saw a text from Troy telling me to keep my phone off except for essential calls. Reporters had somehow gotten my contact information and were trying to reach me for comments. He sent me his direct number again and said to only answer if it was him or Detective Hansen calling. I turned my phone off and shoved it in the dresser drawer. My body felt heavy and strange, like I was moving underwater. I couldn't remember the last time I'd eaten anything, but the thought of food made my stomach turn. Detective Hansen called Troy's number that afternoon and he patched me through. She told me my parents had been formally arrested and charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, and aggravated assault. They were being held at the county jail pending a bail hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning. She needed me to come to the police station to give a formal recorded statement. Everything I'd told her before was preliminary, but now they needed an official video interview for the prosecution. Troy picked me up an hour later and drove me to the station. The interview room was small and cold with a table, 3 chairs, and a camera mounted in the corner. Detective Hansen sat across from me with a notepad, while a uniformed officer operated the recording equipment. She walked me through everything again from the beginning. Finding the invitation outside the basement door, Roger picking the lock, breaking into the hidden room, Sherry with the chain on her ankle, my parents coming home early, all of it recorded on video this time. She asked me to describe the basement room in detail, and I closed my eyes trying to remember. The soundproof padding on the walls, the dirty mattress in the corner, the chain bolted to a pipe, the small bathroom with a broken mirror. She wanted to know about my parents' behavior when they came home. How Mom immediately started lying about Sherry being mentally unstable. How Dad tried to leave before police arrived. How Mom grabbed my arm and begged me to back up their story. Every detail mattered for building the case. Then Detective Hansen asked about my childhood, and whether I remembered anything unusual about my parents' behavior over the years. I started talking, and suddenly things I'd never questioned before seemed significant. My parents never let me go in the basement, always saying it had asbestos or was dangerous. They kept background noise running constantly, fans in summer and a white noise machine in winter, claiming it helped them sleep. They discouraged me from bringing friends over, saying they valued their privacy and quiet. They were obsessive about locked doors and security. Looking back, it all seemed designed to hide what they were doing. Detective Hansen wrote down every detail and said these patterns would help establish premeditation and planning. The charges would be more serious if they could prove my parents had been planning this for months or years before Sherry disappeared. Detective Hansen pulled out a folder of photos from the crime scene and spread them on the table. She needed me to identify items that belonged to my parents and confirm details about the house layout. I looked at the first photo showing the basement stairs and felt my throat tighten. The next one showed the false wall with the paneling that didn't match. Then the broken padlock on the floor. Then the soundproof room itself with the chain still attached to the wall. The dirty mattress with stains I didn't want to think about. A bucket in the corner that must have been a toilet. The small bathroom with rust stains around the drain. Each photo made everything more real in a way that broke through the numbness I'd been feeling. I had to take a break after the photo of the chain because I felt like I was going to throw up. Detective Hansen got me water and waited while I breathed slowly and tried to keep it together. When I could talk again, Detective Hansen showed me one more photo. A tea tin sitting on a shelf in the basement room. She explained their crime scene team had found it during their search and sent it for analysis. The lab detected traces of sedatives inside, the same kind doctors prescribe for anxiety or sleep problems. They were testing it against Sherry's blood work from the hospital, and if the compounds matched, it would confirm Sherry's account of being drugged. That would add another charge of administering drugs without consent. I stared at the photo of that innocent-looking tea tin and thought about Mom making tea and cookies for Sherry 3 years ago. How she'd smiled and acted like a caring adult while poisoning my best friend. How she'd probably done it before, maybe practiced on other people I didn't know about. Detective Hansen watched my face and said they were investigating whether there might be other victims, since people who do something this elaborate rarely start from nothing. I left the police station feeling like my brain was full of static. Troy walked beside me toward his car. not saying anything, which I appreciated because I couldn't have handled small talk right then. He opened the passenger door for me and I slid in, staring at my hands in my lap. They looked like my hands, but nothing felt real anymore. Troy started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, heading somewhere I didn't know. After a few minutes, he told me we were going to meet someone who could help me process what I was going through. Her name was Angela Richards, and she worked with people who'd experienced trauma from family members. I nodded but didn't really absorb the words. We drove through streets I recognized from growing up, past the grocery store where Mom used to take me on Saturdays, past the park where Dad taught me to ride a bike. Everything looked exactly the same but felt completely different, like I was seeing it through a filter that made all the colors wrong. Troy pulled into a small office building and led me upstairs to a door with Angela's name on it. She opened it before we could knock. A woman maybe in her 50s with gray streaks in her dark hair and kind eyes that didn't look away when I met them. She shook my hand and invited us into her office, which had soft lighting and comfortable chairs that didn't feel like a doctor's office. Troy introduced us and explained briefly what had happened, though Angela clearly already knew the basics. She thanked Troy, and he told me he'd be back in an hour, leaving me alone with this stranger who was supposed to help me make sense of the fact that my parents were monsters. Angela asked me to sit wherever I felt comfortable, and I chose the chair closest to the door, some instinct making me want an escape route even though I had nowhere to go. She sat across from me and asked how I was doing, which seemed like such an absurd question that I almost laughed. Instead, I told her I didn't know, which was the truest thing I could say. She nodded like that made perfect sense and explained that what I was experiencing had a name: betrayal trauma, which happened when someone you trusted and depended on hurt you or someone you cared about. The confusion I felt, the guilt, the anger, the numbness that came and went in waves, all of it was normal for what I'd been through. Hearing that it was normal didn't make it feel better, but it made it feel less like I was losing my mind. Angela asked me questions about how I was sleeping, eating, whether I felt safe where I was staying. I answered automatically, telling her about the shelter and the small room, and how I couldn't sleep without seeing Sherry's face or the chain on her ankle. She wrote things down on a notepad but mostly just listened, not trying to fix anything or tell me it would be okay. When the hour was up, Troy knocked and came back in. Angela gave me her card with her cell number written on it and told me to call anytime, day or night, if I needed to talk. She scheduled another appointment for 3 days from now and said we'd work together as long as I needed. Troy drove me back to the shelter and I went to my room, lying on the bed and staring at the ceiling until the light outside faded. My phone buzzed on the nightstand and I grabbed it, seeing Roger's name on the screen. He'd sent me several texts asking if I was okay, and saying the neighborhood had gone crazy. I scrolled through them, reading about reporters camped out on lawns and news vans blocking the street. Everyone was talking about it, he said, and people kept coming to his door asking questions. He sent me a link to a local news website and I clicked it even though I knew I shouldn't. The headline read, "Suburban couple arrested for holding woman captive for 3 years," in big black letters that made my vision blur. Below it was a photo of my parents' house, the one I'd grown up in, with yellow police tape across the front door. The article described the basement prison, the soundproof room, the chain, everything Detective Hansen had documented. It quoted anonymous sources saying the victim had been a family friend who disappeared shortly after the couple's daughter left for college. My hands started shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. The article mentioned me, not by name but as the couple's adult daughter who discovered the victim and called authorities. It made me sound like a hero when really I'd just stumbled onto something I should have known about years ago. I read through the whole thing twice, each detail making it more real and more impossible at the same time. Roger texted again asking if I'd seen it and I typed back that I had, my thumbs clumsy on the screen. He said if I needed anything to just ask, and I thanked him, but didn't know what I could possibly need that would help. I turned off my phone and shoved it under the pillow, but I could still see that headline in my mind, those words that turned my family into a news story. Troy picked me up early the next morning for the bail hearing. I'd barely slept, kept waking up from dreams where I was the one chained in the basement and my parents were standing over me smiling. He handed me a coffee when I got in the car and told me I didn't have to go inside if I didn't want to, that I could wait in the victim services office. But I needed to see this, needed to see what would happen to them. The courthouse was old and imposing, with marble floors and high ceilings that made every sound echo. Troy led me through security and up to the 3rd floor where the courtroom was. We sat in the back row of the gallery and I recognized some faces from the neighborhood, people who'd probably come to watch the spectacle. My parents were brought in through a side door, both wearing orange jumpsuits with their hands cuffed in front of them. Mom looked smaller than I remembered, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, no makeup. Dad walked with his shoulders straight like he was going to a business meeting, not a bail hearing for kidnapping charges. They sat at the defense table with their lawyer, a man in an expensive suit who I'd later learn was named Milo Torres. The judge came in and everyone stood, then sat back down when he did. The prosecutor stood up first, a woman named Celine Hansen who Troy had told me about on the drive over. She was Detective Hansen's sister, which seemed like it should be a conflict of interest, but Troy said it wasn't. Celine laid out the charges in a clear, firm voice that carried through the courtroom: kidnapping in the first degree, false imprisonment, aggravated assault, administering drugs without consent. She argued that my parents were a flight risk and a danger to the community, that they'd constructed an elaborate prison specifically to hold someone captive long term. She presented photos of the basement room, the soundproof padding, the chain, the broken padlock. She described Sherry's injuries in clinical detail: the malnutrition, the infected wounds, the psychological trauma. She talked about the tea tin with sedatives, the purchase records showing premeditation, the 3 years of torture. She asked the judge to deny bail entirely, to keep them locked up until trial. Milo Torres stood up next, and his whole approach was different, softer, more sympathetic. He talked about my parents like they were the victims of some terrible misunderstanding. He said they were longtime residents of the community, pillars of the neighborhood, people with no criminal history who'd lived in the same house for over 20 years. He mentioned their extended family, their ties to the area, their cooperation with police. He characterized what happened as a complicated family matter that had been blown out of proportion, suggesting that Sherry had been staying with them voluntarily at first, and things had gotten out of hand. The lies came out of his mouth so smoothly that for a second I almost believed him, almost thought maybe there was some explanation that made sense. Then I remembered the chain, the soundproof room, the 3 years, and I wanted to scream at him that he was lying, that he knew he was lying. He asked the judge to release them on reasonable bail with GPS monitoring and regular check-ins, arguing that they deserved the presumption of innocence. I gripped the edge of the bench so hard my knuckles went white, watching the judge's face for any sign of what he was thinking. The judge took his time, looking through the documents in front of him and asking both lawyers questions about the evidence and the charges. Finally, he announced his decision. Bail was set at $500,000 each, with conditions. They had to surrender their passports, submit to GPS monitoring, stay away from me and Sherry, and check in with the court twice a week. If they violated any condition, they'd go straight back to jail with no second chances. The judge's voice was stern when he explained the no-contact order, making it clear that even indirect contact through third parties would count as a violation. Mom started crying when she heard the amount, these big dramatic sobs that echoed through the courtroom. Dad just stared straight ahead, his face blank. Troy leaned over and whispered that $500,000 was high enough that most people couldn't post it, that I probably didn't need to worry about them getting out. But within 3 hours, Dad's brother had posted bail for both of them, using his house as collateral. Troy got the call while we were eating lunch at a diner near the courthouse. Listen to 90 Seconds and rate me 5 stars on Spotify. Doing a giveaway for people who did this and show proof on my Instagram. There will be 4 winners, and you get to choose between a Spotify or Amazon gift card. His face went tight, and he immediately started updating my safety plan, making me promise not to go anywhere alone and to call him if I saw them anywhere near me. The thought of them being out there, free to move around even with the GPS monitors, made my stomach turn. I couldn't finish my food. 2 days after the bail hearing, Troy called to tell me Sherry was discharged from the hospital. They were moving her to a different safe location than mine, somewhere my parents wouldn't know about, for security reasons. He said she was doing better physically, but still struggling with everything that had happened. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Sherry's new number. She wrote that she was scared, that knowing my parents were out on bail made her feel like they could find her any second and finish what they'd started. She said she couldn't sleep without checking the locks on the doors and windows over and over, that every sound made her jump. I stared at the message and tried to think of something reassuring to say, but how could I reassure her when I was just as scared? I typed back that they had GPS monitors and couldn't come near us without the police knowing, but even as I sent it, I knew how weak it sounded. The monitors only told the police where they were after the fact, not before. If my parents decided to come after us, the monitors wouldn't stop them, would just help the cops find our bodies later. I deleted that thought before I could type it, and instead told Sherry I was here if she needed to talk. She didn't respond, and I didn't blame her. Detective Hansen called me the next afternoon with an update that made everything worse. Her team had traced purchase records from the past few years and found receipts showing my dad had bought soundproofing materials, heavy-duty chains, and an industrial-grade padlock 3 months before Sherry disappeared. He'd used cash for most of it, but one purchase at a hardware store had been on a credit card they'd tracked down. The dates lined up perfectly, proving that this wasn't some impulsive thing that got out of control like the defense attorney had suggested. My parents had planned this for months, had prepared that basement room specifically to hold someone prisoner. Detective Hansen explained that this evidence of premeditation would strengthen the prosecution's case significantly, that it showed intent and planning rather than a crime of opportunity. She asked if I remembered anything from that time period, 3 years ago, whether my parents had been acting strange or doing construction in the house. I tried to think back, but it was all fuzzy, just normal family stuff from before I left for college. Then I remembered Dad saying he was soundproofing the basement for a home theater he wanted to build, and Mom laughing about how he never finished projects. I told Detective Hansen and heard her writing it down, her voice gentle when she said that detail would be important for trial. After we hung up, I sat on my bed in the shelter and felt sick, thinking about how they'd been planning to kidnap someone. Maybe Sherry specifically, or maybe just someone, while I was living in that house eating dinner with them every night. Detective Hansen picked me up a week later to take me back to the house so I could collect my belongings. I'd been putting it off, but I needed clothes and my laptop and other stuff I'd left there. The crime scene tape was gone, but the house still looked wrong somehow, like it was marked even though there was no visible sign. We went in through the front door and the smell hit me first, that familiar scent of home that now made my stomach turn. Everything looked exactly how I remembered it. The couch where I used to watch TV, the kitchen table where we ate meals, the photos on the walls of us smiling like a normal family. But now I could see things I'd never noticed before. The furniture was arranged so you couldn't see the basement door from most of the living room. The family photos were all carefully staged, everyone positioned just right, smiles that looked real but probably weren't. The white noise machine on the hall table that Mom always said helped her sleep. I walked through the room slowly, Detective Hansen following behind me, and it felt like touring a crime scene even though this was where I'd grown up. Every corner held memories that were now tainted. Every object made me question what I'd thought I knew. I went upstairs to my old bedroom and started packing clothes into a duffel bag Troy had given me. My hands shook as I folded shirts and jeans, thinking about how Sherry had been in the basement suffering while I slept in this bed completely unaware. While I was packing, my hand hit something hard under a pile of old sweatshirts in my closet. I pulled out a stack of journals from high school, the kind with cheap cardboard covers that I'd filled with teenage thoughts and daily events. I hadn't thought about these in years, but now I opened one randomly and started reading. The entry was from junior year, talking about how I'd heard weird noises at night, like someone crying or screaming far away. But when I asked my parents about it, they said it was probably just the neighbors or animals outside. Another entry mentioned how Dad had gotten angry when I suggested having a sleepover with friends, saying our house wasn't appropriate for guests, and I should go to their houses instead. A third entry described how Mom had acted strange around Sherry specifically, always watching her with this intense look I couldn't figure out. I flipped through more pages and found dozens of little details like this, things I'd written down and then forgotten because they seemed minor at the time. But now, reading them all together, I could see the pattern I'd missed. My parents had been acting suspicious for years, had been planning or hiding something, and I'd been too trusting to see it. I'd missed all the signs because I'd believed they were good people, because I'd never imagined they could be capable of something like this. That realization felt heavy in my chest, like a stone sitting on my lungs making it hard to breathe. I showed the journals to Detective Hansen, and she asked if she could take them as evidence. I handed them over, glad to have them out of my hands. Detective Hansen drove me back to the shelter with my bags of belongings and the journals in an evidence box. Before I got out of the car, she turned to me with a serious expression and said they were investigating whether there might be other victims. She explained that predators like my parents rarely started with something as elaborate as that basement prison, that they usually worked up to it over time with smaller crimes. She asked if I remembered any other people who'd disappeared from the area, or if my parents had ever acted suspicious around any of my other friends, or if there'd been any unexplained absences or trips they'd taken. I sat there trying to remember anything useful, scanning through years of memories now colored by suspicion. I thought about the girl from my middle school who'd moved away suddenly, or at least that's what everyone said. I remembered a college student who'd gone missing from the next town over around the time I was in high school. I told Detective Hansen about both, and she wrote down the names and details, saying her team would look into any possible connections. She thanked me and said I'd done the right thing by being honest, that every piece of information helped. But as I walked into the shelter carrying my bags, I couldn't stop thinking about how many other Sherrys there might have been, how many other people my parents might have hurt while I lived in that house completely blind to what they were doing. 2 days later, Troy called to tell me Sherry had finished her forensic interview with Detective Hansen. His voice sounded tired when he explained it took almost 6 hours, because Sherry had to walk through every detail of what my parents did to her over 3 years. The detective was building a timeline of events for the prosecution, and apparently Sherry remembered way more than anyone expected considering the trauma she went through. Troy said she was incredibly strong during the interview, but broke down afterward, and hearing that made my chest feel tight, because I couldn't stop thinking about how my parents caused all that pain. He told me the detective was really impressed with how much specific information Sherry provided about dates, times, and particular incidents, which would all help build the case against my parents. The next morning, I got a call from someone named Celine, who introduced herself as the assistant district attorney handling the prosecution. She asked if we could meet to discuss the case strategy and my possible testimony, and just hearing the word testimony made my stomach drop. We met at her office that afternoon, and she sat across from me with a thick file folder and explained that my testimony about finding Sherry and my parents' behavior when they came home was crucial evidence. She needed to know if I was willing to testify against them in court, and the way she asked made it clear this was a big decision. I felt physically sick thinking about sitting in a courtroom and talking about my parents like they were criminals, even though I knew that's exactly what they were. But I looked at Celine and told her I'd do whatever helps Sherry get justice, even if it destroys me inside. She nodded and scheduled another meeting to prepare me for what testimony actually involves, then warned me the defense attorney would try to make me look unreliable or suggest I misunderstood what I saw. That thought scared me because what if I said something wrong and messed up the whole case? Roger called me that evening and his voice was shaking when he told me someone left a note on his parents' doorstep. The note said to keep his mouth shut about things that don't concern him, and it wasn't signed, but the threat was super clear. He took photos of it and reported everything to Detective Hansen right away, and she told him she was taking it seriously. The detective assigned extra police patrols to his neighborhood and started investigating who might have sent it, probably someone connected to my parents or their lawyer. Roger sounded scared but also mad, saying he wasn't going to let some anonymous threat stop him from doing the right thing. 3 days after that, Detective Hansen called with results from the forensic lab. The sedatives they found in the tea tin matched exactly with the compounds in Sherry's blood work from the hospital, which proved my parents drugged her just like she said. Even better for the case, they found my dad's DNA under Sherry's fingernails from when she fought back during her escape attempt. The patterns of scrapes and cuts on her ankle lined up perfectly with the chain they pulled out of the basement wall, and all this evidence together painted a really clear picture of what happened. Detective Hansen sounded satisfied when she told me this stuff, like all the pieces were finally clicking into place. A week later, Celine called to tell me that Milo Torres, the defense attorney representing my parents, had reached out about a possible plea deal. He suggested my parents might plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for a lighter sentence, basically trying to avoid going to trial. Celine explained she told him absolutely not unless the deal included serious prison time and my parents admitting everything they did to Sherry. She wanted me to know about these discussions but made it clear she wasn't accepting any deal that let my parents off easy. I started seeing Angela for therapy sessions twice a week, and she helped me work through the weird grief I felt about losing my parents. Not losing them to death, but losing them to the truth of who they really are, which somehow felt worse. Angela taught me breathing exercises for when I got overwhelmed and kept telling me that feeling conflicted didn't make me a bad person. She said it was normal to still love your parents even when they did terrible things, and that I didn't have to choose between supporting Sherry and mourning the parents I thought I had. Late one night, my phone buzzed with a text from Sherry saying she couldn't sleep because of nightmares about my parents finding her again. I called her right away, and we talked for over an hour while she described the dreams where they broke into wherever she was staying and dragged her back to that basement. I promised her they were being monitored with GPS and couldn't get anywhere near her, but I could hear the fear in her voice and knew my words probably sounded empty. She asked me if I thought they'd actually go to prison, or if somehow they'd get away with everything, and I didn't know how to answer that. Detective Hansen discovered something interesting when she pulled the utility records for my parents' house going back 5 years. The power consumption showed weird patterns with big spikes that lined up with when they were running the soundproofing equipment and extra lights in the basement. The electric company data showed these patterns started about 4 months before Sherry disappeared, which meant my parents were setting everything up way in advance. This evidence showed how deliberate their crime was and how many resources they put into keeping Sherry imprisoned without anyone knowing. 3 weeks after my parents got arrested, Troy called to tell me that my dad's brother had contacted him. My uncle wanted to know if I'd be willing to meet with my parents, so they could explain their side of the story, like there was some explanation that would make kidnapping and torture okay. Troy told me in a really firm voice that meeting them was a terrible idea that could mess up the case and definitely mess up my mental health. I agreed with him completely, and said to tell my uncle no, without me having to talk to him directly, because I had nothing to say to anyone defending what my parents did. A few days later, Roger called asking if we could meet at a coffee shop near the shelter, somewhere neutral where we could talk without my parents' shadow hanging over us. I got there first and sat in the back corner with my hands wrapped around a cup I wasn't drinking, just needing something to hold. Roger walked in looking tired but determined, and he slid into the seat across from me without ordering anything. He told me the threatening note thing had really messed with his head at first, made him wonder if testifying was worth the risk to his family. But then he thought about Sherry chained in that basement for 3 years and realized staying silent would make him part of the problem. He said he was committed to testifying no matter what happened, that he saw what he saw and telling the truth was the only option. His loyalty hit me hard because most people from my old life had disappeared once the news broke, like my parents' crimes made me toxic by association. I reached across the table and grabbed his hand, telling him he was a better friend than I deserved, and he just shook his head and said this wasn't about deserving, it was about doing what's right. We sat there for a while not saying much, just existing in the same space without the weight of explaining or justifying, and it felt like the first normal moment I'd had in weeks. 2 days after that meeting, someone knocked on my door at the shelter and handed me an envelope with my name written in Mom's handwriting. My hands started shaking before I even opened it because I knew she wasn't supposed to contact me at all. Inside was a letter on floral stationery, the kind Mom always used for thank you notes and birthday cards, and seeing her familiar handwriting made my stomach twist. She wrote that she loved me more than anything, and everything they did was to protect Sherry from herself, that Sherry had come to them talking about ending her life, and they couldn't let that happen. The letter went on about how they were trying to help Sherry work through her problems in a safe environment, how the chain was only for her own protection, how they gave her food and comfort and care. Every sentence was a manipulation, rewriting 3 years of torture as some kind of intervention, and I felt sick reading it. She ended with a plea for me to visit her, to let her explain in person, to remember that she was still my mother who had always loved me. I took photos of every page with my phone, and then called Detective Hansen immediately, my voice shaking as I explained what had just been delivered. The detective told me to bring the letter to the station right away, and not to respond to Mom in any way. Detective Hansen met me in the lobby when I arrived and took the letter with gloved hands, placing it in an evidence bag while I explained how it had been delivered through someone I didn't know. She documented everything, taking my statement about receiving it and photographing my phone pictures as backup. Then she called someone at the courthouse to report the no-contact violation, her voice firm as she described the clear breach of bail conditions. She told me this was serious, that judges don't take kindly to defendants who ignore court orders, and that Mom's bail would likely be revoked. I felt this weird mix of relief and guilt, knowing my mom would go back to jail but also knowing she'd brought it on herself by trying to manipulate me. Detective Hansen walked me back to my car and reminded me that Mom's letter was just more evidence of her controlling behavior, that loving parents don't gaslight their children about kidnapping and torture. The bail revocation hearing got scheduled for the following week, and Troy called to ask if I wanted to attend, even though I didn't have to be there. I said yes because I needed to see this through, needed to watch the system actually hold my parents accountable for something. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, just the judge and some court staff and the lawyers and my mom in her orange jumpsuit with her hands cuffed. Celine presented the letter as evidence of the violation, explaining how Mom had circumvented the no-contact order by using an intermediary to deliver her manipulative message. Milo Torres tried to argue that Mom was just a mother reaching out to her daughter, that the emotional distress of being separated had clouded her judgment. The judge cut him off and said bail conditions exist for a reason, that Mom had been explicitly ordered to have no contact with me and had deliberately violated that order. He revoked her bail right there, ordering her back to jail until trial, and I watched as the officers led her away. She looked back at me with this wounded expression like I'd betrayed her, and I had to look down at my hands to avoid her eyes. Dad was still out on bail, but with even stricter monitoring, and the judge warned that any violations from him would result in immediate revocation too. After the hearing, Troy took me to meet Sherry at his office, so they could work on filing a protective order against both my parents. Sherry looked better than the last time I'd seen her, less hollow and more present, though she still had that wariness in her eyes like she expected something terrible to happen at any moment. Troy explained that a protective order would legally prohibit my parents from coming within 500 feet of her or attempting any contact, with criminal penalties if they violated it. Sherry signed the paperwork with steady hands and answered all of Troy's questions about the threats my parents had made regarding her family. The court granted the order that same day given the circumstances of her kidnapping and the ongoing criminal case. Troy gave Sherry a copy of the order and explained she should carry it with her and call 911 immediately if my parents tried to contact her or came anywhere near her. She folded the papers carefully and put them in her bag, and I could see some of the tension leave her shoulders knowing there was at least this legal barrier between her and them. Detective Hansen called me in for another recorded statement a few days later, this time wanting me to focus specifically on my parents' behavior throughout my childhood. I sat in the same interview room as before and tried to organize my memories into something coherent and useful. I described how my parents had gradually cut off contact with my dad's siblings over some argument I never fully understood, how they discouraged me from inviting friends over, and always had excuses about the house being messy or them being too busy. I told her about their obsession with privacy, how they'd installed extra locks on all the doors and had cameras pointed at the driveway, how they always wanted to know where I was and who I was with. Detective Hansen asked if they'd ever been controlling about my friendships, and I remembered how they'd subtly discouraged me from getting too close to Sherry, making comments about her being a bad influence or too needy. Looking back at it through this new lens, I could see they'd been grooming their environment for years, setting up conditions where they could hide someone in the basement without neighbors or family getting suspicious. The detective recorded everything and told me this pattern of isolation and control would help establish their predatory mindset for the prosecution. Celine scheduled separate meetings with me and Sherry to prepare us for the possibility of trial, and mine happened first on a Tuesday afternoon in her office downtown. She sat across from me with a legal pad and explained exactly what a trial would involve, from jury selection, through testimony, through verdict. She walked me through the kinds of questions the defense might ask, how they might try to suggest I was mistaken about what I saw, or that I had some reason to lie about my parents. Celine told me defense attorneys sometimes attack witnesses' credibility by bringing up any past issues or inconsistencies in their statements, trying to make the jury doubt their reliability. She was honest that trials are traumatic experiences, that having to testify about your parents' crimes in front of a courtroom full of strangers takes a serious emotional toll. But she also said the evidence in this case was so strong that she expected the defense would ultimately accept a plea deal, rather than risk a trial they couldn't win. I asked her what would happen if they did go to trial, and she said both Sherry and I would have to testify about finding her in the basement and everything that happened after. The thought made me nauseous, but I told her I'd do it if that's what it took. Over the next few weeks, Celine's team compiled everything they had into one massive case file that apparently made conviction almost certain. The utility records showed the weird power consumption patterns in the basement. Purchase receipts proved my dad had bought all the soundproofing and restraints months before Sherry disappeared, and forensic evidence tied everything together with DNA and injury documentation. Medical records from the hospital detailed every wound and showed the malnutrition and psychological trauma from prolonged captivity. Detective Hansen's interviews with me, Roger, and Sherry provided eyewitness testimony about the discovery and my parents' reactions. Troy had statements from Sherry about the torture and threats, and even the tea tin with sedative residue had been tested and matched to compounds found in Sherry's blood. Celine told me that Milo Torres had reached out again with a more serious plea offer, which suggested my parents were finally accepting they couldn't win at trial. She said she'd consider any offer that included significant prison time and full admission of guilt, but she wasn't interested in letting them minimize what they'd done. The formal charges got finalized around this time, and Celine called to walk me through each one. Kidnapping in the first degree because they'd taken Sherry by force and held her for more than 12 hours with intent to harm. False imprisonment for keeping her locked in the basement for 3 years. Aggravated assault for the physical torture she'd endured. Administering drugs without consent for the sedatives they'd used to initially capture her. Each charge carried serious prison time, and Celine explained the prosecution was seeking consecutive sentences rather than concurrent, which meant the sentences would stack on top of each other instead of running at the same time. She estimated my parents would face at least 20 years, and possibly much more depending on how the judge sentenced them. Hearing the specific charges laid out like that made everything feel more real and final, like the legal system was actually taking this seriously instead of just going through motions. Plea negotiations picked up intensity over the next 2 weeks, with Milo Torres pushing hard for concurrent sentences that would reduce my parents' actual time in prison. Celine told me he was also trying to get them to avoid admitting the full scope of what they'd done, wanting to characterize it as a situation that got out of hand rather than deliberate torture. She stood firm that any plea must include complete allocution, which meant my parents would have to stand in court and admit every single element of their crimes on the record. No minimizing, no excuses, no reframing it as anything other than kidnapping and torture. Milo kept coming back with revised offers, and Celine kept rejecting them because they didn't include enough prison time or full accountability. She updated me after each negotiation session, and I told her not to accept anything that let my parents off easy, or let them avoid admitting what they'd really done to Sherry. The back and forth felt exhausting, even though I wasn't directly involved, just knowing these negotiations were happening and my parents were trying to weasel out of consequences. When details from the charging documents became public, media coverage exploded to a level I hadn't anticipated. Reporters camped outside the courthouse waiting for any updates on the case, and somehow they found out where I was staying because news vans started appearing near the shelter. Troy helped me avoid them by using back exits and timing my movements carefully, always reminding me I had absolutely no obligation to make any public statements. The relief I felt hearing that was enormous because I couldn't imagine facing cameras and microphones, trying to explain my parents' crimes to strangers who just wanted a sensational story. Troy said the media attention would probably die down once the plea was finalized, that right now they were feeding on the shocking details, but eventually they'd move on to the next horrible thing. I stayed inside as much as possible and kept my phone off except for essential calls, trying to create some barrier between myself and the public spectacle my family had become. Celine called me 3 weeks later with news that the plea negotiations finally wrapped up. My parents accepted a deal that included guilty pleas to every single charge: kidnapping in the first degree, false imprisonment, aggravated assault, drugging without consent, all of it. In exchange, the prosecution would recommend 25 to 30 years with possibility of parole, instead of pushing for consecutive sentences that could have meant 50 years or more. She explained the math in a way that made my stomach hurt. They would serve at least 25 years before even being eligible for parole, and given that mom was 52 and dad was 55, they would be in their late 70s before that possibility even existed. The parole board rarely granted release to violent offenders on their first try, so realistically they would probably die in prison. Hearing her say that out loud made everything feel final in a way nothing else had. 2 weeks later, Celine scheduled a meeting at her office to prepare me and Sherry for the plea hearing. She walked us through exactly what would happen in court, how the judge would question my parents to make sure they understood what they were pleading guilty to, how they would have to admit each element of their crimes out loud for the record. Then she explained we would both have the chance to read victim impact statements before the judge decided on sentencing within the agreed range. She encouraged us to write down how their crimes affected our lives, to be honest and specific, to take our time with it. The statements would become part of the permanent court record, and the judge would consider them when determining the exact sentence. I spent the next several days working with Angela during our therapy sessions to write my victim impact statement. Every attempt felt either too angry or too sad or too detached, like I couldn't find the right words to capture what it felt like to discover your parents were monsters who tortured your best friend. Angela kept reminding me there was no perfect way to do this, that whatever I wrote would be enough, that showing emotion in court was completely okay and probably necessary. She helped me organize my thoughts into sections covering the betrayal I felt, the grief over losing the parents I thought I had, the guilt about all the years Sherry suffered while I lived my normal college life completely unaware. By the fourth draft, I had something that felt true, even if it didn't feel adequate. Sherry met me at a coffee shop near the shelter and showed me her victim impact statement. Reading it made my hands shake because she described the 3 years in detail: the physical torture, the psychological games my parents played, the constant fear that she would die down there and no one would ever know. She wrote about the nightmares she still had every night, the panic attacks that came from nowhere, the way she couldn't be in small rooms or hear certain sounds without feeling like she was back in that basement. At the end, she wrote that she was determined to rebuild her life, but that she would carry these scars forever, that my parents had stolen 3 years she could never get back and damaged her in ways that would take decades to heal. She looked at me with red eyes and said she was terrified to read it in court, but she was going to do it anyway because they needed to hear what they did to her. I promised I would be right there in the courtroom supporting her through the whole thing, that she wouldn't be alone. The night before the plea hearing, I lay in my shelter bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep despite being completely exhausted. My brain kept running through everything that happened since I found that invitation in the basement. Sherry chained up in the soundproof room, Roger breaking the lock, my parents coming home early, the police arriving, the hospital, Detective Hansen, the arrests, the bail hearing, all the evidence piling up, the media coverage, the plea negotiations, and now tomorrow, my parents would stand in court and admit what they did, and some part of this nightmare would finally be over, even though I knew the emotional aftermath would last much longer than any prison sentence. Troy picked us up early the next morning to avoid the worst of the media crush at the courthouse. Even so, the building was packed with reporters, cameras, curious people who wanted to see the couple who kept a woman prisoner for 3 years. Troy guided me and Sherry through a side entrance that court staff used, and we waited in a small private room with uncomfortable chairs and bad coffee until it was time to enter the courtroom. A bailiff came to get us around 9:30, and we walked through a side door directly into the courtroom. Judge Patrick Stevenson was already on the bench, a man in his 60s with gray hair and a serious expression that made it clear he understood the weight of what was about to happen. My parents were brought in through another door, both wearing orange jail uniforms and restraints on their wrists and ankles. They looked smaller somehow, diminished, like the jail time had already started shrinking them down. Mom's eyes scanned the courtroom and found mine, and I looked away immediately because I had nothing left to say to her. No connection left between us worth acknowledging. The allocution took over an hour as the judge questioned my parents about each charge and required them to admit every single element of their crimes in detail. They had to describe how they planned Sherry's kidnapping, how they called her over with a fake story about a gift from me, how they drugged her tea with sedatives, how they carried her unconscious body down to the basement room they had spent months preparing with soundproof padding and chains. They had to admit they kept her imprisoned for 3 years, that they tortured her regularly, that they threatened her family to keep her compliant. Mom cried through parts of it, but the tears felt performative, like she was trying to earn sympathy she didn't deserve. Dad's voice stayed flat and emotionless as he recited the facts, like he was reading a grocery list instead of confessing to years of torture. After the allocution finished, Judge Stevenson asked if there were victim impact statements, and Celine indicated there were 2. Sherry went first, walking to the podium with her printed statement and shaking hands. She read in a steady voice that only shook a few times, describing 3 years of torture and ongoing trauma in words that made several people in the courtroom cry. When she finished, she looked directly at my parents and said she hoped they spent every day in prison thinking about what they did to her. Then it was my turn. I walked to the podium and told the court about the parents I thought I had versus the monsters they actually were, about the betrayal that shattered my entire understanding of my childhood, about learning that every family dinner and birthday party and Christmas morning was a lie because the whole time they were keeping Sherry chained in the basement. I talked about the guilt I carried for not seeing the signs, for being the daughter of people who could do something so horrible, for living my normal college life while my best friend suffered. I ended by saying I was committed to supporting Sherry's healing while working on my own, that they had damaged both of us in different ways, but we would survive this together. Judge Stevenson listened to both statements without interrupting, then announced he was sentencing my parents to 28 years in prison, at the higher end of the recommended range given the severity and duration of their crimes. As the bailiffs led them away, Mom tried one last time to catch my eye, but I refused to look at her. Sherry grabbed my hand and we walked out of the courtroom together through the side exit Troy had waiting. Outside, the afternoon sun was bright and warm, and we stood on the courthouse steps for a moment just breathing. The legal battle was over. My parents would spend the rest of their lives in prison, but Sherry and I were free and our personal healing was just beginning. That's where we will stop for today. I am really glad you were here because it makes sharing these stories feel worthwhile. I hope this one left you a little lighter than before. Subscribe if you would like to keep listening together.